Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Health, Happiness, and Performance Show. I'm your host, Dave Mayo from HackYourGut.com, and today we're going to talk about building the best diet for you. Now, a lot of us see such and such as the best diet, whether you're talking about paleo, keto, carnivore, plant-based, vegan. Everybody has an opinion on diet, and everybody has a diet that has worked for them, and people have had diets that simply don't work for them. We're individuals, and what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for the other, but it's super common to get advice from other people. So if you have a friend that did well on keto, that's great, but that doesn't necessarily mean keto is good for you. A lot of factors go into what type of diet best suits an individual. For example, some people do well by restricting carbohydrates, but carbohydrates really aren't that interesting of a food to them. Maybe they really like meat, cheese, and things of that nature, so they'll thrive on a keto diet. But if you're somebody who does particularly like carbohydrates, you're going to include them in your diet, then a keto diet probably isn't right for you. Ultimately, compliance is the most important factor for the success of a diet. That's why people can lose weight on a high-carb diet, a low-carb diet, a high-fat diet, low-fat diet, animal-based, plant-based. Basically, you can run the gamut. So normally a person's entrance into diet comes through one of these kind of more trendy diets, such as paleo, keto, or carnivore. There are a couple of reasons for that. Normally, these diets come with a backstory that kind of hooks you in, even though a lot of the times the backstory isn't necessarily correct. The other thing is people like direction, and when you give them very concrete ideas of things they should eat and that they shouldn't eat, it's easier for them to stick to it. If you say, well, you can eat carbs, but you only should eat them at this time, that time. Nuance is not particularly good for people who have problems losing weight or, trying to determine the diet that's most healthy for them. So a diet where it goes, eat this, don't eat that, is way easier to follow than one that requires some level of nuance. Now, I'll go back into my history. I followed the paleo diet. I followed multiple diets. I've done low carb, I've done straight keto, Atkins style keto, South Beach, a cyclical ketogenic diet. But ultimately, the most recent iteration of that form of a diet that I followed is the paleo diet. And the idea behind the paleo diet is that more modern foods, some of us are simply not adapted to, and they can cause problems. So a paleo diet generally eschews all processed foods, or at least it initially did. And in addition to that, it restricts foods that are grains, legumes, or dairy due to the potentially immunogenic nature of these foods, meaning that since, for example, people are allergic to certain legumes, dairy is a very common allergen, and a lot of people have issues with gluten, particularly people with celiac disease or people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is kind of hard to define. But the problem is that those aren't the only immunogenic foods. For example, eggs are extraordinarily immunogenic. Egg allergy is one of the most common allergies you can be exposed to. And one of the things I noticed while I was deep into the kind of paleo style of diet is most of these people who were, wouldn't touch soy or beans or cheese or dairy with a 10-foot pole are eating like 2 to 3 dozen eggs a week. So it doesn't really make sense. It makes sense that people who are allergic to or sensitive to certain foods should avoid them, but it doesn't make sense that since some people are having problems with these foods, that everybody should follow these restrictions. Which is why these diets like paleo, keto, plant-based, and even carnivore can be very effective for having a baseline diet. But you don't just want to stay there. If you are not allergic to eggs and you enjoy consuming eggs, there's no reason for you to avoid eating them. Same if you go carnivore. A lot of people who've gone carnivore are no longer truly carnivore. They're consuming honey and rice, quote-unquote non-toxic plant sources of food. But ultimately, this is all kind of, there's not really a reasoning behind this. Essentially, people try a diet, it works for them, they promote it online, and then in real time, you're seeing them go through a situation where that diet is too restrictive for them. So now they're letting in honey, now they're letting in rice and other quote-unquote non-toxic plant foods. But ultimately, that's because we are not carnivores. We are not ketogenarians. We are not paleovores. We are omnivores, and most of us can get by eating a large swath of different foods. One thing I have noticed, particularly working with people, is that when people restrict certain foods for a long amount of time, they have problems reintroducing these foods. So I think a lot of this probably has to do with the microbiome, particularly if you're completely avoiding plant foods. So what we want to do is, if you're going to take one of these restriction diets and use that to develop your own personal best diet, what we want to do is use that as a starting point, but then we want to reintroduce foods slowly but surely to find a diet that is not only good for us, but is diverse, so we can get nutrients from a whole wide range of foods. A lot of these diets, when you kind of get into the logic behind them, there's not really a ton of logic. Neolithic foods, meaning foods created from agriculture after the quote-unquote Paleolithic man, they are not necessarily bad for you. For example, olive oil is fantastic for you, and it is a highly processed food. You're essentially extracting the oil from olives. It would meet, in my opinion, it meets the classification of a highly processed Neolithic food, yet it's fantastic for you. Doesn't mean you can't eat too much of it, and doesn't mean that it's right for everybody. So I think in a lot of these, the way these things work, again, whether you're talking about paleo, vegan, keto, carnivore, these diets work for an individual. That individual then forms that opinion and then tries to develop the backstory behind it. Why is this logical? And ultimately, when you kind of go that way and you don't really use the data to drive the decision making, use the decision making to look for the data, you get some wonky types of things. And you also find ultimately you're taking your own health into your own hands, and you're trusting it with people. You really want people who are using data to guide their decisions and not emotion or hunches. For example, I mentioned in my most recent episode regarding the Precision Health Report how my blood lipids, specifically my LDL and my ApoB, are high, but everything else is great. And if you look at my numbers, I almost to a T fit the description of what is commonly referred to in social media as a lean mass hyperresponder, meaning I have these high blood lipids, but I have low markers everywhere else, and that those markers will protect me against cardiovascular disease, and there's little to no risk to me. The problem is, this is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is essentially, I think this happens, with no data really to support it. And I think that the lean mass hyperresponder hypothesis is an interesting hypothesis, and I would love for it to be true, because then I don't need to worry about my high LDL or ApoB. However, the data does not back that up at all. I don't believe it's based off of any good data. I think that's hey, I did a keto diet, I lost weight, I feel good, but look at my blood lipids. That must actually be a good thing because I feel good. But you feeling good now does nothing for predicting your risk of cardiovascular disease 10, 20, 30 years from now. So I would love nothing more for the lean mass hyperresponder hypothesis to be true. I just think there's way too much data indicating that it's probably not. And I personally don't want to take the risk of accumulating plaque on my artery walls to find that out. There's ample evidence that lowering your LDL cholesterol and ApoB containing particles is going to independently lower your risk for cardiovascular disease. So why wouldn't you do that until we get the data? And that's essentially what I'm doing. So, like I said, it's excellent. You do a keto diet and you lose weight, you feel good, you have tons of energy. That's a starting diet. You don't necessarily have to stay keto forever. You might want to implement certain foods, maybe not necessarily high carbohydrate foods, but maybe some fibrous veggies. A lot of people that I found, most anybody I've ever worked with who does a keto diet is not doing a clean type of keto diet. They're eating tons of processed meats, tons of meats in general, little to no plant-based foods, tons of eggs, tons of cheeses and things of that nature. And it's not to say that those foods are bad for you. It's just an imbalanced diet when you have absolutely no fiber, nutrients coming from plants, which plants and animals provide not only a different array of micronutrients and minerals, but also different forms of different minerals and nutrients. Phytochemicals in plants have been shown to be very beneficial. So there's a lot of things. There's good things in all foods. We don't want to just pick a super restrictive diet and then stick with that. Pick that super restrictive diet, do it for 4 to 8 weeks, and then start trying new foods. And that's really important, because I think a lot of people just stop. And the reason I think about that, the reason I think people do that is that people stop because they're led to believe that there are certain things in plant foods, or there's certain things in animal foods, or certain things in grains that are toxic to all humans. Oxalates are one common thing. Gluten, certainly. Casein from cow dairy. So it's really important to understand that, yes, some people have problems with that, and it may even be you, but just because some people, let's say, have a problem with soy doesn't mean that it's a good idea for you to restrict all legumes. In fact, it's kind of foolish to do so, based off of mechanistic studies, which a lot of this stuff is based off of. A lot of these foods, particularly with paleo and keto, that people tell you to avoid, and carnivore as well, are associated with a longer life. That doesn't mean that they promote a longer life, but it means that they are conducive to having a longer, healthier life. So why on earth would you not include them in your diet? It is true that maybe it has nothing to do with that. There is a healthy user bias, but in no way are healthy users a monolith. I would consider myself a healthy user. I don't smoke, I exercise, I strength train a lot, I'm outside all the time, I eat a healthy omnivorous diet, I eat a high fiber diet, I eat a high protein diet, but there are things I do that are not healthy. I drink alcohol, for example, and healthy users are not a single person. There are healthy users who eat a plant-based diet. There are healthy users who eat a non-plant-based diet. So that healthy user bias is not a great way to just say, I'm assuming that this is just the healthy user bias. The healthy user bias, while true, does not eliminate the effect of the associations found in an epidemiological study. They certainly alter it, but a lot of things alter it, and they try to control for that stuff, which is why you see it's controlled for BMI and things of that nature. So we don't just want to throw out evidence that we don't like because it doesn't follow our preconceived notion. I am super guilty of this, and we're going to talk about my diet journey now, which should kind of give you some insight into the journey that I've taken, and chances are the journey that you will take too. I was super restrictive on the paleo diet, and I'm eating most of the things I wasn't eating then, and aside from like cow milk, which we'll talk about that as well, I do well with most of this stuff. So my diet journey, as I mentioned, I've done everything. I've successfully just counted calories. I've done Atkins keto, cyclical ketogenic diet, which effectively means you're strict keto for a little while, and then a day or two you kind of go off, and then there's also an old diet I did. It was a kind of a package with exercise called the anabolic burst cycle dieting and exercise, which was effectively something like 2 weeks of keto, 2 weeks of a higher carb. At least that's how I did it, and I had pretty good results with it. I do pretty well on most diets. I've done South Beach. I've done volumetrics. Volumetrics is simply just these foods tend to be low energy density, so things that are bigger yet contain less calories, such as fruits and vegetables, and that stuff all worked out. But in 2010, I decided I wanted to try the paleo diet. A friend had told me about it, and I had amazing results. And I believe I started it around November. Over the holidays, over about 2 months, I dropped like 20 solid pounds. I went from 220 to 200. I'd been 220 basically since college at that point, so pretty close to 10 or 15 years. And I lost weight. I felt amazing. I had tons of energy, didn't need to sleep a lot. Then kind of hit a sticking point, which you do with all diets, and then I decided to kind of restrict my carbohydrates. So my initial paleo diet was effectively loaded with broccoli and Brussels sprouts and salads and things of that nature. And then I not so much potatoes, sweet potatoes, and what was commonly referred to as healthier starches, non-grain based, and not really potatoes, although I did eventually switch to potatoes. I switched to a low-carb paleo diet, and then weight just flew off me again. I probably lost another 15 pounds, so now I was down to about 185, and then I just kept pushing it, got down to 172. I was sickly. I did not look good. Looking back at pictures, my face was all gaunt, and I was much smaller than I am now. And I realized around that point that my restriction was causing me problems. So I ended up having issues with my digestion, very low energy levels, sleep was messed up big time, had a lot of bad things going on. So it actually took me a while to kind of reincorporate carbohydrates into my diet, because when you take them out of your diet for a while, it often takes a little while for your body to readjust. I started with circadian rhythms, which play a role in regulating all aspects of your metabolism, but particularly insulin sensitivity. So I was doing most of my carbs earlier in the day. I started incorporating more higher fiber foods, and currently I'm at 185 pounds. I easily have 10 to 15 pounds more muscle than I did when I was at 172. Feel much better, and like I said, I felt great on the diet initially, but over time I kind of faltered, and it just wasn't really the diet for me. I still do think that there are some beneficial aspects of the diet. Try to stick with whole, natural, unprocessed foods, of course. But I currently eat all sorts of grains, all sorts of legumes, and a wide swath of dairy. And I did better without them, and then I started to do poorly, and I reintroduced them, and I feel great now. I feel amazing, and my precision health report indicates I'm doing pretty well, at least with respect to insulin sensitivity and inflammation. So I have no interest in changing my diet currently, but the important thing to understand for this is I felt good, and then I didn't. And if I was kind of promoting the paleo diet as the one true diet for people, and you follow this in real time, you would have seen that. You would have seen like, okay, he was grains, at one point grains, legumes, and dairy are off limits. Then all of a sudden, we're eating very, very low carb, and then finally coming full circle, I felt better. And I think that's following in real time. You're going to see a lot of people do this. A lot of people who push a plant-based diet, a keto diet, a carnivore diet. You're going to watch all of these people kind of more or less regress to the mean. They're up here, they're eating an extreme diet, and this is where they were before. They're going to kind of fall somewhere in the middle. Extreme diets are not great in general. Most people are not going to thrive long-term on an extreme diet. But if it's a diet that you follow and it's easy to follow and you can stick with it, again, compliance is key. So if it works for you, that's great. I just see a lot of people kind of pushing X diet as the one true human diet, which, let's face it, that's not actually true. And some people are going to have problems with some foods that other people don't. And you as an individual need to realize that this is a journey. What works for you now might not work for you in 10, 15, 20 years. I fully expect as I get older and get into my 60s, I'm probably going to have to definitely going to have to slash my calories. I'll keep my protein elevated to maintain muscle mass, but there's no way I'm going to maintain that muscle for the rest of my life. And generally speaking, you're going to see a reduction in the size of the more glycolytic or carb burning muscle. So, I'll probably have to lower my carbohydrate intake to kind of maintain healthier blood glucose levels throughout the day. It's perfect now, 4.9 on the A1C, and superb oral glucose tolerance test. But this was a journey for me. I started with the restriction diet, and unfortunately I wasn't wed to the restriction diet, because if I was wed to that diet, it would not have been a good situation for me. If I was still avoiding the foods that I no longer avoid, I would probably still be relatively sickly and feeling much older than I actually am. And so that kind of brings us full circle. People are going to avoid foods, and if they're bad for you in general, that's great. By all means, don't eat them. But if it's just kind of based on a story, again, like paleo, avoid grains, legumes, and dairy because they're Neolithic foods, and they may cause problems with us, or, you know, we are carnivores and we are not meant to eat plant foods because they're stressors. You need to realize that all foods have stressors. All foods have bad components. All foods have components that mechanistically can make somebody sick or cause deleterious effects in individuals, but that does not mean the food as a whole is bad. Relying on single mechanisms and single dietary components like gluten, for example, or globulins in legumes, or phytoestrogens in soy, for example. Avoiding foods just based off of one single food is kind of foolish. That's why we are interested in outcome data. We don't care if there are single mechanisms within foods that can cause problems, especially if there's like 30 things in that food that are beneficial. You don't necessarily want to remove it, and I'll be discussing in some short episodes specific foods I eat, why I eat them, and why people may think that they are bad for them. But you really do not want to rely on mechanisms to drive dietary decisions. You want to look at the human outcome data, and of course you want to look at your own data, your own anecdotal data, to see, you know what, if you eat, let's say, cheese, and that causes a problem for you. Most people, cheese is a very healthy food. For some people, it's just not right for them, and that's great. That you by no means should avoid it, but you should not tell everybody that everybody should avoid cheese because of X, Y, Z. Now we're going to kind of use an example to kind of follow the reasoning why relying on single mechanisms is foolish. So there's something that causes muscle catabolism, increases free radical production, floods the body with stress hormones, spikes your glucose, and causes metabolic stress. So based on all of those mechanisms, that's something you should absolutely avoid. It's got all these things wrong with it. The problem is we also have human data looking at what this thing does. And spoiler alert, this thing is exercise, which is literally one of the most healthy things you can do for your body, provided you're doing it properly. So if you had people cherry picking studies, finding mechanistic problems based off of these things, most people try not to increase their free radical production. Most people try not to flood their body with stress hormones or spike their glucose. But here we have something that does all of these mechanistically deleterious things. That is one of the most important things you can do to age healthfully. So this is the trappings of mechanistic data. I have fallen for these trappings, particularly as it relates to things like omega-6 fatty acids being inflammatory, which we have human data showing that they're really not. And when you think about it logically, this means that anytime somebody would have come upon something high in omega-6 fatty acids, that it would cause inflammation. That is crazy. The human body is way more complex than that. And fortunately for me, I do eat relatively high omega-6 in my diet, but I get more than enough omega-3s, which basically the data shows that if you're worried about the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, the thing you should really worry about is the total amount of omega-3s and getting adequate levels. Based on my inflammation levels, which again are around the second percentile, meaning they're very, very low, I don't need to worry about this. You shouldn't take that it works great for me as gospel to you. You should perform a kind of N=1 experiment with yourself, and you should be measuring these outcome measures to potentially help you make better decisions. So that's a perfect segue into developing the best diet for you. The first factor that's super important is measure. Don't rely on the stories told by people pushing diets such as the Paleo Diet, Keto, Carnivore, whatever. Do not rely on those stories. They're awesome stories. If they get you interested in a diet that improves your health, that's wonderful, but measure. There are things you should be measuring to make sure that the diet's working out for you. The measures that I care about, body mass index. I know a lot of people say, well, you know, somebody who has a very high level of musculature, BMI doesn't really account for. BMI accounts for the vast majority of people. I've been exercising my entire life. I'm around 185, 195 pounds, and I carry more muscle mass than most people. The BMI classifications work perfectly for me. And it's pretty crazy because at around 185, I'm a hair over the healthy range. So I should be around 180, 185, which seems about right to me. And I do notice if I get up over 190, I do start to kind of feel more sluggish. So BMI, unless you are a genetic freak or a bodybuilder or somebody using anabolic steroids, BMI is more than likely a perfectly good measure for you. Body fat percentage, muscle mass, which you can kind of figure out. You can take a DEXA scan to follow that if you want. And then your blood pressure is another important one. You want to keep that within healthy ranges. Mine is 120/78. I do believe that is generally where you want to be, 120/80. I know they have kind of increased it to 130/85 or 90 perhaps, but I think you do want to be a little lower than that. And then waist to height or waist to hip ratio is another important factor. And that's being used as a better marker than BMI, because if you are tall and very muscular, you're generally not going to be kind of pear-shaped. You're going to have a ton of weight around your midsection, so your waist to hip ratio would still be good. So you can, or waist to height ratio. So waist to height ratio, BMI, use whichever you want. They're effectively measuring the same thing, and they're identifying that you do not want central adiposity, which is fat around your midsection. Insulin sensitivity, which I showed you the Precision Health Report using lipoprotein insulin resistance as a measure. You can measure insulin sensitivity that way. You can try an oral glucose tolerance test. The problem is it doesn't really tell you what insulin's doing. So a fasting insulin can be very useful. Triglycerides and Hdl, the last I checked, is a pretty good marker. The triglyceride HDL ratio is a pretty good marker of insulin resistance. Hemoglobin A1C, which I use a test from CVS, an at-home test. It's like 2 tests for $40 or $45, and I've done it 3 times now on the same date that I've gone in and got my comprehensive metabolic panel, and it was within 0.1% every single time. So it's a pretty effective way of doing it regularly yourself without having to go to Lab4 request to have it done. And finally, an oral glucose tolerance test. Very useful just to see how your body responds to a glucose or a carbohydrate load. You can also use it to see if you have a huge difference in insulin sensitivity between the morning and the afternoon or night. Oral glucose tolerance test, effectively what you do is you measure your blood glucose fasting. You take this drink that's around 75 grams of glucose dextrose, and then you follow your blood sugar every 30 minutes. Ideally, you should be coming back down to your fasting level within 90 minutes to 2 hours. And finally, inflammation, which you can measure with glyc-A or C-reactive protein, measures of systemic inflammation. Now, where would I start if I was an individual? I would probably start on a Mediterranean diet or an omnivorous diet. If you know you have food sensitivities, something where you're going to like a keto or an all meat diet may be beneficial, and then you could find the vegetables and plant materials that work best for you. I tried to force myself to eat beets for the longest time. Every single time I ate them, it would just turn my stomach. That's not an overt sensitivity to the food, but they're god-awful. They taste like dirt. I was doing it primarily for the betaine. I do know they can boost nitric oxide, and I think they're a pretty good source of magnesium as well. Love beet greens, but beets themselves are terrible. Another thing, while I was doing the keto diet or the paleo diet, I would avoid peanut butter because I was told, peanuts, can be unhealthy. They're a legume. You can have you can be sensitive or intolerant to them. But interestingly, I actually had a bigger problem with almonds, which is, you get rid of peanut butter, you add in almond butter, or you start eating almonds because you're no longer eating peanuts. And almonds make my lips go numb every single time I eat them. Peanuts, I have absolutely no problem. I assume this is somehow related to the microbiome. I have no idea. But as you can see, based on the principles of the paleo diet, I'd be better off restricting peanuts than almonds. But with the outcome data in myself, it turns out to be the opposite. So that's why it's important to try something, test. If you're removing things from your diet, you can reintroduce them. I did that way back then. Probably 2011, 2012 is where I realized that I was going to avoid things like almonds and things of that nature. Now, you can start with a short-term restriction diet if you like. The problem is, if you do that, you need to have a plan of reintroduction. And that's critically important in this whole process. You want to start to reintroduce foods one at a time. The problem is most people don't do that step, and they end up on a super restrictive diet, and they start restricting more things. That's kind of how I think a lot of people get to carnivore. They start with, they get into a paleo diet, but then they realize, oh, these oxalates are a problem, or these salicylates, or all these things are a problem, and all of a sudden they're only eating meat, and then there's no way out for them. You definitely want to do reintroduction. It's critically important. And this is a phase most people skip, and it's one you're eventually going to do, and probably a lot of the people who recommend these diets, you'll see them kind of, again, it's kind of regression to the mean, super restriction, but then they start adding foods in that they enjoy. Most people will do well on a more balanced diet. It doesn't mean that everybody has to eat, 40 plant based foods every week or whatever. Find what works right for you by doing a restriction diet or doing any old diet, and then testing things and seeing how you respond, and then adding in and pulling things out. Ultimately, the most important thing you need to worry about is compliance. Any diet will work. People lose weight on every diet. So provided you feel healthy, provided you feel like this is something you're going to stick to for the rest of your life, stick with it. Don't let, I'm telling you that, maybe a keto diet might not be the best diet for you, or a carnivore diet. If it works for you, don't listen to me. But whatever you do, make sure that you don't just become complacent and say, I found the best diet for me. I found the best diet for me about 10 or 15 times. And ultimately, where it always came back to is it's going to be an omnivorous diet. It's going to be a diet that doesn't restrict a lot of things, but limits them. I eat bread. I don't eat bread for every meal. I used to eat bread for every meal. I eat a lot of things I never would have eaten before, simply because looking into them, they turn out to be super healthy. So that's the most important take home. If you're trying to build the best diet for you, it's a process, it's an evolution, and don't look at snapshots in time from social media influencers or people who've written diet books. Don't look at those snapshots in time. Follow the path of how this goes. A lot of people start super restricted and then end up coming back to, I'm an omnivore. I eat a lot of stuff. I don't try to eat a ton of bread. I do like pasta. I'm not going to cut it out of my life for the rest of my life, but maybe there's a way to include it in my diet so that it's not something that every time I eat it, I eat an entire bowl. So again, find something that works for you, and just make sure you're continually evolving to find a diet that makes you healthy. Make sure you're measuring things, and that'll give you an idea as to how effective your diet is. So that essentially sums it up. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at dave@hackyourgut.com. Put some questions down in the comments section, and there'll be an accompanying blog that comes with this video that you can, I'll have some sources for some of the stuff I said. So thank you all very much for joining in. Next time I'm going to do a couple of shorts. We're going to talk about some of the fermented foods that I consume, and then we're going to have some more individual shorts about foods that I eat and why I eat them and why I think that they promote health. So thank you very much for joining in, and have a nice day.